Please join me in giving David Kensinger a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
I've been blessed in many ways to be born in this country and to be born to my parents. One of them is that my mother is a vocal music teacher and taught me from a young age diaphragmatic breathing. So I'm going to assume y'all can hear me without the microphone. Yeah. All good? Thank you, John, for the introduction. Love coming to Pachyderm. Best club in the state. Wonderful group you have here. So happy to see how it continues to grow. I tell you, I was looking back at when we scheduled this talk originally. He said, why don't you come down to you do the post-election talk? You've done it before. He says, how about the Friday after the election? And I said, you know, based on what I'm seeing this year, there's a pretty good chance the election's not over by then. So how about we do it the first Friday in December 4, because by then, the election will definitely be over, right? Now, as it turned out, Petroleum Club had its issues, so we came down here, and we are now almost to that point. There's actually one U.S. House race in the United States that does not have a certified result yet.
22 New York.
22 New York, yeah, excellent. And it's your classic example of you don't need a conspiracy, mere incompetence will do. I encourage you to read up on the ballot counting process in New York 22 and the sticky notes and the lost thumb drives and the ballots discovered in drawers 8 weeks after Election Day. It's a wild deal. But one of the things you do in preparation for a talk like this is you go back and you look at the video you've had, of previous talks. I didn't do too badly. Last set of predictions we had. I had a couple that maybe my enthusiasm got a little ahead of me, didn't quite appreciate the difficult cycle 2018 would be. There was one I really didn't like. I've got to correct this for the record. I confused 2 U.S. senators from Montana. I said Max Baucus when I meant Conrad Burns. I had to apologize for that one. But most of the other stuff we got right. And most of what we were headed towards this year came this way. Now look, none of this is copyrighted. I mean, if anybody is really interested in it, I'd be happy to give them a copy of this when this is over. Don't stress notes. You have a copy when we're done. That's my email, okay? I apologize for the long domain name. Kensinger, it's a great name. It's a little long, okay? But Kensinger, KensingerAssociates.com. Anybody has any questions? Anybody, want advice or help? Anybody want a copy of this or any of the data in it? Happy to give it to you anytime, okay? What happened? We're going to spend a lot of time on what happened in 2020. The other thing I discovered, going back, looking at videos of previous talks, is when I forecast what's going to happen in the future, I do pretty well. When I talk about what's happened in the past, I bat 1,000. So that's what we're talking about this time. What happened? Why it happened, we'll talk a little bit about that and even less about what will happen next, because I don't do as well when I talk about what's going to happen in the future. The biggest story, the single biggest thing that happened in the 2000 election was that our politics in the state of Kansas and in the country scaled up. If you think about 2 measurable things in politics, money raised and votes cast, okay, 2 things you can look at over time. We had much, much more of both of those things in 2020 than we've ever had before. More money and more votes, okay? University of California at Santa Barbara, UCSB, voting eligible population percentage. So take the number of U.S. citizens, okay, who are eligible to vote, not disqualified, say, by previous felony conviction or someone, and then you take the total number of votes cast and you divide it by the total voting eligible population, you get a percentage. If you have 100 million people who are eligible to vote, 58 million show up, you get a 58% turnout of voting eligible population. So if you go back as far as 1992, according to the University of California, Santa Barbara, 1992, Ross Perot runs, nice juice and turnout, 58.2% of Americans eligible to vote show up, cast ballots in a presidential election. That dropped in 1996, went back up in 2000, big jump between 2000 and 2004. You've probably heard the media talk about before the great surge of enthusiasm and turnout that came with President Obama's candidacy in 2008. Really, the jump was between 2000 and 2004. And I'm going to maintain the biggest reasons for that were advances in technology and an increase in the amount of money in politics. You're going to hear a lot from the media, oh, money in politics is bad. Well, if you think voter turnout's good, if you think people being involved in politics is good, more money facilitates that. It facilitates more communication. In my experience, Republicans tend to do pretty well in elections that are about issues. And the more money there is in the process, the more chance you have to talk about those things, and the less reliant you are on the media. The media doesn't like money in politics because it makes them relatively less important. I'm really sad about that. Really busted up. But in the year 2000, think about that. We remember that presidential election, 105.5 million people voted for president. Then it went all the way up to 60%, 61, back down to 58, 59, pretty consistent. In 2016, we had 136 million certified votes for President of the United States cast, tabulated in certified official results nationwide. In 2020, we had 159 million. We had 23 million increase. Go back here, the biggest number we have here is 61.6, right? 66.7 in the 2020 election. This was by far the biggest turnout election we've had in a long time, measured by total number of votes, 23 million more than the one in second place. By percentage of voting eligible population, okay? Biden won 81,283,000, or 51.3%. Voter turnout in 2020 was the highest in 120 years when measured as a percentage of the voting eligible population. Big turnout election. People noticed, people cared, people showed up. Doesn't mean the media got it right. Media polling was awful. It's been awful in recent years. We've got more polling than ever before, so we have more bad polling than ever before. Democratic nominee Joe Biden maintains a substantial lead over President Donald Trump. According to a CNN poll, 54% back Biden and 42% Trump. That was published the Thursday before the election. 12-point lead for Joe Biden. In its final polls going into Election Day, CNN had Biden up 10. NBC actually interrupted Sunday Night Football to say, Biden's up 10. New York Times had Biden winning Iowa by 9 points, Ohio by 10. ABC and Washington Post had Trump down 17 points in Wisconsin. All had Biden winning Florida. Trump would go on to win Iowa and Ohio easily while recapturing Florida. Ohio went to Biden, but only by 0.7 percentage points, not 17. Media polling was awful in this election. The media polling in this election is an example of confirmation bias. The tendency of people everywhere to give outsized importance to data that fit their preconceived or preferred outcomes. And since we can all generally guess what the preconceived and preferred outcomes of the media are, they gave outsized weight to polls that showed Biden doing well. And make no mistake, that had an effect on the outcome as well. Trump came achingly close to an electoral college victory. Donald Trump came within 42,918 votes. Biden's combined margin of victory in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin of a tie in the Electoral College. If you think about Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, Nebraska is one of 2 states that award individual electoral votes by congressional district. Trump came 65,009 votes away from an outright majority. What's the other state that does individual congressional districts? Maine. Man, what a crowd. Money for president. Talk about politics scaling up. In 1996, the major party nominees for president spent about $450 million. Look again at the huge increases there from 2000 to 2004 to 2008. By the way, sometimes you'll hear folks talk about we need public financing in campaigns or expenditure limits in campaigns. You know, the only place in federal elections where we have anywhere in statute taxpayer funding of campaigns and expenditure limits is in presidential campaigns. It was established in the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, but you have to opt into the system. You have to choose to be a part of it. John McCain, Republican nominee in 2008, believed in government regulation of campaign spending. Co-author of McCain-Feingold, which got all the big money out of politics, remember? In 2002, we passed McCain-Feingold, so all the big money went out of politics, remember that? He actually opted into the system. He accepted taxpayer money for his presidential campaign in 2008. He accepted expenditure limits. And the Democratic nominee, the great unicorn out of Illinois, Barack Obama, champion of expenditure limits in public financing, then discovered how much money he could raise and said, I'm not going to do that anymore. And he ended up outspending John McCain about 3-1. And there you have what is to me the greatest accomplishment of the Obama administration. He destroyed public financing of presidential campaigns. No one, no major party nominee has opted into that system since then, and none ever will. Because you have more Americans engaged than ever before, technology allows people to take out their phone and contribute to a presidential candidate now. So you raise much more money than ever before. 1.64 billion, 2.39 billion in 2012. So look at 2000 to 2012. In 12 years, you had more than a tripling of the amount of money spent on presidential campaigns. 2020, heaven knows, but it's a lot more. We won't know until all the reports come in, but we set a record. The most expensive Senate race was North Carolina. That's because, of course, in Georgia, you ended up having 4 races. You had 2 seats up, you had a general election, you had a runoff election. Those 4 elections together, probably $850 million for 2 Senate seats in Georgia. We used to spend $650 million on the presidential campaign. We just spent $850 million on 2 Senate races in Georgia. In the Kansas Senate race, to give you some context, some historical baseline, in the last competitive Senate race we had in Kansas, which was Pat Roberts' re-election in 2014, his campaign raised and spent a little over $8 million, about $10.5 million spent on his behalf, call it $18.5 all in. His opponent, the independent Greg Orman, $5.7 million in his campaign, about $6.8 million outside, yeah, call it $12.5. Any idea what Barbara Bollier raised in 2020? $28.8 million. That's the campaign. That's not the campaign plus, the Sierra Club or Emily's List. That's not the campaign plus the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. That's the campaign. Okay, $28.8 million through November 23. Marshall got over $30 million in party help, all in. Bollier ROI. One of our guests here today is Colby Sandlin, great gentleman, man I've been privileged to know. Taught me the phrase ROI. ROI stands for return on investment. Anybody can spend a lot of money. That's no trick. Joe Biden never came to Kansas and ran no specific Kansas advertisements. He got 570,323 votes, according to the official canvas. Barbara Bollier ran all out for a year and raised and spent more than any candidate in state history for any office. More than $36 million all in. 571,530 votes. $36 million, 1,207 votes. Back of the envelope, $30,000 a vote. Somebody asked me, what could Bollier have done differently? I looked at this, I said, how about an event in all 105 county courthouse squares and just make a pile of money, set it on fire, and hand out marshmallows? Holy cow! $36 million to get 1,200 more votes than the presidential nominee who never came to the state? 30K additional vote, wow. Okay? It was a great night for Republican women in particular. I want to highlight that. In 2018, we had 36 first-term Republicans elected to the House. 1 was a woman out of 36. In 2020, we had 94 female nominees for U.S. Congress as Republicans in the United States. The highest we'd ever had before was 53. A woman won in almost every district that Republicans flipped, a strong showing that brings credibility to the argument that conservative women can win competitive seats if they can survive a primary. All 13 of the Republicans who had been certified as winners in Democratic-held districts were women and or minorities, including 3 of Cuban descent, 2 of Korean, 1 African American. Of the 46 freshman Republicans serving the House, 18 are women. We went from 13 Republican women in the last Congress to 29 in this one. That's still too low, but that's real good progress. That's a strong move in the right direction. By and large, in Kansas, Republicans did pretty well. Kansas Democrats were frustrated. Roger Marshall, you remember, this is a race we were going to lose. You remember this one. We won 53.2% to 41.8%. It's 11.4%. What's amazing to me is if you go back and you look basically at my lifetime, I'll turn 50 this year, God willing, how consistent Senate results are in the state of Kansas. That with the exception really of Bob Dole's re-election in 1974, which was extremely close in a Watergate election, that every Republican senator who has served Kansas has one race that was pretty close. And by pretty close, I mean they win it by 10 or 11 points. And every other race, Republicans win with 60% of the vote. Pat Roberts in 2014 won 53.1 to 42.5. Sam Brownback in 96, 53.9 to 43.3. Nancy Kassebaum, 53.9 to 42.4. The Republicans operate in a margin of less than 1 percentage point. The Democrats operate in a margin of about 1.2 percentage points. Pretty remarkable over time. Congressional race results are very good. Tracy Mann, 71-29. Jake LaTurner, 55-41. Ron Estes, 64-36. I want to talk a little bit about Amanda Adkins, the one federal race we lost in Kansas, who was, by the way, one of the founders of the Eisenhower series, which started here in Wichita, which was designed to educate and empower more Republican women to run for office. Trump went down from 20.6 to 14.7 in his margin in Kansas. In Johnson County federal races, President lost by 28,000. Senate nominee Roger Marshall lost by 27,000. Amanda Adkins lost by 23,000. There are people who tell you, that's a shame we lost that race in the 3rd district, and it is. And hopefully we can fix that in 2022. I want to note Amanda Adkins, full disclosure, friend of mine for over 20 years. Somebody I had the opportunity to work with, work for, hire, be hired by. She led the Republican ticket in Johnson County by quite a margin. She ran very well. Strong consistency in federal races. In 2016, every U.S. Senate contest nationwide was won by the party which carried the presidential vote in that state. Since the adoption of the 17th Amendment, allowing for direct election of United States senators, that had never happened before. It happened in 2016. In 2020, it happened again. Every state that went blue for president went blue for Senate. Every state that went red for president went red for Senate, with one exception. What was the one exception? Maine again. Maine was the answer to both questions. There will be at most 17 congressional districts that split their tickets, that voted Trump for president and Democrat for Congress, or Biden for president and Republican for Congress. In the past century, that's the fewest we've had, there were 35 of those districts, twice as many 4 years ago, and about 5 times as many 12 years ago. You've never seen this kind of alignment between presidential votes, U.S. Senate votes, U.S. House votes. In Kansas, the other big news here was a big shift in the electorate from voting on election day to voting early by mail. In 2016, about 27% of the ballots cast were early in person. That's how I like to vote. I want to feel it in my hands. I want the ballot in my hands. I want to fill it out. I want to triple check it. I want to walk up. I want to look at that machine. It says 178 ballots tabulated. 179. I feel good. I go home, I sleep at night. I'm not handing my ballot to somebody else to feed into a machine. I want to feed it into the machine. That's just me. 27% of ballots cast early in person, but look at the shift between election day and mail voting. In 2016, 14% of Kansans voted by mail, about 59% voted in person on election day. In 2020, a third of the vote was cast by mail, and under 40% was cast on election day. You essentially had a shift of 19.2% away from election day in-person voting towards early mail voting. That is a giant shift, and it's probably the most significant enduring change we saw in 2020 for Kansas elections. State legislative races in Kansas and nationally. Eric Holder's NDRC. Who is Eric Holder? Former Attorney General of the United States. What's the NDRC? The National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Redistricting is, by its nature, essentially the most partisan political process we engage in the United States, apart from elections themselves. So Eric Holder, Attorney General, upholder of the common good, naturally, as soon as he leaves office, takes over the most partisan assignment he possibly can. This was entirely new for him because he was an absolutely even-handed, nonpartisan Attorney General. As he said, the biggest rigged system in America is gerrymandering. What does it mean to gerrymander? Named for, actually a signer of the Declaration, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, who drew a congressional district in 1790 to benefit his political allies that looked a bit like a dinosaur, or as they said in the press at the time, a gerrymander. So that became a verb over time. To draw legislative lines for the purpose of political advantage, be it partisan or personal, is to gerrymander. The National Democratic Redistricting Committee, chaired by the 82nd AG of the United States, is the first ever strategic hub for a comprehensive redistricting strategy. The NDRC is attacking this problem from every angle to ensure the next round of redistricting is fair and reflects the will of the voters. Now, believe it or not, there are elements of the press that do really great work. When he announced this effort, he went around and he was asked about this. This is the 3rd congressional district in the state of Maryland, which does not even qualify as a gerrymander. As described by the Maryland League of Women Voters, the single worst gerrymander in the nation, as described by a federal judge, a blood splatter at a crime scene, a Rorschach test. Now, who writes the lines in Maryland? Democrats do, the supermajority in the Maryland legislature. So Eric Holder was asked about that. He said, that's one step. It's like, it's the ship that did the Kessel Run under 12 parsecs. Isn't a parsec a unit of distance? 2012 to 2018, on this map, Maryland Democrats averaged 61% of the vote for U.S. House seats and never won less than 87% of the seats. As to those who say it's only one district, here's Maryland 4, described by a federal judge as a broken-winged pterodactyl lying prostrate across the state. Texas 1994 congressional races. This was my first federal race. I got to work for a young former Secretary of Agriculture, Sam Brownback, running for an open seat in Kansas. I graduated college in '93. 1994, we overturned 40 years of Democratic rule of the House of Representatives. The Democratic congressional map had been drawn by a man named Martin Frost, one of the smartest human beings I've ever met. He's a Democratic member of Congress from Texas, ranking Democrat on the Rules Committee. So successful was he that in 1994, Republicans got about 55% of the vote for Congress in Texas, and Democrats won over 60% of the seats. Democrats got about 42% of the vote and won 63% of the seats. To show how unfair that was, Eric Holder was the Deputy Attorney General in the Clinton DOJ, which supported the Texas map. But remember, Eric Holder is here to make sure it's fair. The Democratic Redistricting Initiative, led by Barack Obama and Eric Holder, has raised a whopping $52 million in the year since its founding. That was last year. They raised more than that this year. This was a 9-figure operation. He targeted 13 states, including Kansas. Well, they've got a Democratic governor in Kansas, so if they can just elect enough Democratic legislators, they can uphold her veto. We'll stop a Republican gerrymander in Kansas. Can donors to former Obama Attorney General Eric Holder's campaign to take control of state houses get their money back? Democrats on Tuesday failed to flip any of the GOP legislative chambers they targeted, and Republicans expanded their majorities in STEM state houses. Over $100 million spent. Zero chambers turned. As the map below shows, Republicans set to control redistricting of 188 congressional seats, Democrats about 73. Republicans won almost every election where redistricting was at stake. Kansas State Legislature, Senate came back 29-11. That was exactly where it was going into Election Day, allowing for the fact that two people who had been elected as Republicans in 2016 had switched to Democrats, including Barbara Bollier and the new Democratic leader, Dinah Sykes. Kansas House Republicans gained 2. Went from 84-41, the barest supermajority, to 86-39. This was the 6th consecutive cycle with Republican legislative supermajorities. Between 1972 and 2008, there was not a single election in Kansas where Republicans had a 2/3 majority in the State House and State Senate. They've done it 6 elections in a row now, 2010, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20. Not all the news is good. Johnson County, which has historically been a bastion for Republicans, actually cast more votes for Democratic candidates for state Senate this year than it cast for Republican candidates for state Senate. The Democratic financial advantage in the 3 districts they won, 7, 8, and 21, was 582,000 to 103,000. Republicans were outspent badly in state legislative elections in Kansas in 2000. All 4 Republican state senators elected from Johnson County, in districts, I should say, entirely within Johnson County. You also got Molly Baumgardner, who extends into Miami County. But the 4 Republicans elected from state Senate districts entirely within Johnson County, Mike Thompson, Beverly Gossage, Rob Olson, Kelly Warren, all won by 6 points or fewer. That's to underscore, even though the overall results were good for Republicans, came very close to a disastrous outcome in Johnson County in state Senate races. Almost a wipeout. Why or how? I don't particularly credit the Sedgwick County, Shawnee County, and Southeast Kansas Republican parties. The Sedgwick County Republican Party recruited candidates in every legislative district in Sedgwick County. That's a great accomplishment. The Shawnee County Republican Party did the same, and Southeast Kansas managed it as well. First quarter last year, we were on the course for potential disaster here. We could have had a wipeout in state Senate elections in Johnson County. That would have meant every issue you care about the state, budget, tax, life, redistricting, all would have been compromised. You could have had a Democratic U.S. Senator from Kansas. As it turned out, you got Chuck Schumer anyway. I particularly want to note a guy I've worked for, a guy I'm proud of, Governor Collier, who stepped in and provided great leadership in 2020, helped to have electable Republican candidates be nominated and win the fall. It matters. Enduring feature of Kansas politics going forward, the 7 most populous counties in Kansas: Johnson, Sedgwick, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Douglas, Leavenworth, Riley, in that order. They cast about 58% of the statewide vote, and they're about even right now in terms of Republican and Democratic legislative members. The other 98 counties cast about 42% of the vote, and they're 64-1 Republican in the state legislature. The other notable feature of 2020 Kansas elections was the collapse, the obliteration, the disappearance of the Kansas Democratic Party at a legislative level outside the 7 biggest counties. To underscore that, there's only 1 Democratic member of the legislature who lists an official residence outside the 7 most populous counties in Kansas. That's Jason Probst from Reno County, okay? And he won by the smallest certified margin of any legislative contest in Kansas. He and Tom Hawk, Democratic senator from the 22nd District, lives in Riley County, are the only 2 Democratic members of the legislature that represent a precinct with voters in it outside the 7 most populous counties in the state. In January, House Democrats, U.S. House, represent 51% of all U.S. House seats, but only 16% of the nation's total land area. The smallest geographic footprint in modern history for a majority. And to kind of underscore this, you look as a scientist for what's a consistent data point I can look at. Eber Phelps is a former Democratic member of the legislature from Ellis County, okay, where Hayes is. In 2012, he got 45% of the vote. He got 4,387 votes out of 9,739 cast. He won his seat back in 2016 with 53.5% of the vote, got about 1,000 more votes in a pretty comparable turnout. By 2020, turnout had increased more than 15%. He got the fewest votes he'd ever gotten. That's the collapse of the Democratic brand in rural Kansas. Shawnee County State Senate races, Republicans actually swept all three. Got more votes than the Democrats did. That was despite a significant Democratic advantage, but much less pronounced than in Johnson County. I want to give a shout out to Senator Wagle and the Republican State Leadership Committee, who recognized a vulnerability. The longest serving member of the Kansas legislature in history was the Democratic leader in the Kansas Senate, Anthony Hensley, 44 years, in a district that Donald Trump carried in 2016. And so against an entrenched Democratic incumbent who had not lost an election in 44 years, they made an investment, and as a result, they flipped that district to Republicans. That took a lot of vision on their part. I want to commend them for that. Brownback effect. I'll confess, I worked for Sam Brownback for 25 years. Along with my wife, best person I ever met. Still the all-time record vote getter. In 2004, Sam Brownback got 780,000 votes. The second most votes anyone's ever gotten for any office in the history of the state of Kansas is Caleb Stegall. Who's Caleb Stegall? He's a member of the Kansas State Supreme Court. That was his retention election in 2016. He was nominated by Sam Brownback. In the three contested GOP primaries for U.S. House in 2020, that is to say in the 1st District, the 2nd District, and the 4th District, people who served in the Brownback-Collier administration got a majority of the vote in all three of those primaries. In 2020, Kansas Democrats invested a significant amount of money, by my back of the envelope, about $1.8 million in television, telling people you can't vote for Renee Erickson. She supports the Brownback agenda. Anyone remember that? Can't vote for Mike Peterson. Can't vote for Jake LaTurner. Can't vote for Amanda Adkins. Can't vote for Christian O'Shea. Can't vote for Brenda Dietrich. Every one of these people won. Except Amanda Adkins, who led the Republican ticket in the 3rd District. I would argue we have another significant piece of evidence from 2020, which is whatever mileage Democrats thought they could get out of running against Sam Brownback, that strategy has passed its sell-by date. What happens next? In the words of the great American political scientist Fats Waller, one never knows, do one? I'll give you 3 facts. The only living Democrat under the age of 65 to have won a federal or statewide election in Kansas is Sharice Davids. The last 4 midterm elections in the United States, 18, 14, 10, and 6, have been wipeouts for the party that held the White House. No Kansas Democrat has won a federal or statewide election under a Democratic president in this century. Kansas Democrats just put together $36 million for a Senate seat they had a slim chance of winning. You've got to assume they'll have a comparable amount of money in 2022 to defend an incumbent Democratic governor. The 2022 general election has an extra week in it, because the election day is November 8, the latest calendar day it can possibly be. But Republicans would need over $300,000 a day in the general election to get to $30 million. What happens next? One never knows, do one. Never underestimate an incumbent governor, and do not underestimate the incumbent governor of Kansas, who has never lost an election. I'm going to stop there. Take any questions y'all have. I hope this was enlightening and entertaining.
What did the Democrats do behind closed doors, assuming legitimately, all the mail ballots, but extra? She got 2,000 more votes than Lynn Rogers did 4 years ago.
Overall, or just in mail ballots?
Overall.
Overall. The first thing is you saw a bump up in statewide turnout, okay? We had 1.375 million people vote in Kansas, okay? The previous high we had had was 2016, which was about 1.225. So you had 150,000 more people vote statewide in Kansas than had ever voted in an election before. So Kansas and national politics scaled up. You had 150,000 more voters than you'd ever had in an election before. If you divide that by 40 state Senate districts, okay, that's close to 4,000 voters a district. You two ran very close. It's about 2,000 extra votes. So I'd say at a minimum, part of the explanation for that is an overall increase in turnout, which I think was driven by voter engagement and spending in 2020.
Thanks, this has been really interesting. So the last couple of days has been kind of discouraging, I think, for a lot of us. Do you have any sense of how that's going to impact the Republicans? You know, typically we have a wipeout 2 years from now, we should all be going home happy. But how's this going to impact it, or will it? Or what's your thought about what the trajectory is?
I want to actually, I thought that might come up, thank you. I actually want to commend Mr. Biden for something he said yesterday, which is the people who charged the U.S. Capitol violently, and fortunately we have really good video of the people who did that, several of whom have already been arrested and should be arrested. Those people are not Republicans, okay? Let me make clear, as somebody who spent 25 years in the Republican trenches, those people aren't part of the Republican Party, okay? I was blessed 3 times in my life to be a public servant. Once in the U.S. House of Representatives, once in the U.S. Senate, and once in the office of the governor of the state of Kansas. When you get your little badge, you take an oath. And the oath is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The American idea of justice, okay, is based in several important principles. America is not a tribe that emerged from the mist. It is a country with a conscious founding moment. And it is a nation, to borrow a phrase, dedicated to a proposition. That proposition includes that all human beings have value, okay, because they're all creatures of God. They're all products of a creator, capital C. That they all have inalienable worth and rights that pre-exist and transcend government. Okay, that they're all equal before the law. And that government exists to secure those rights, deriving its just power from the consent of the governed, as expressed through elections. That's why elections are so important. One of the things I was very privileged to do when I was a congressional staffer was I got to give tours to people from Kansas of the Capitol building. I tried to do it at least once a week. It was a real treat for me. I'd spend 1 or 2 hours, even as Chief of Staff of the United States Senate, I like to give tours to people from Kansas who'd come to the Capitol building. And we'd always stop in the rotunda. In the great rotunda of the Capitol, there's 4 paintings at eye level, okay, by a man named John Trumbull. One of them pictures the Second Continental Congress, okay, people lining up to sign the Declaration of Independence. The other 3 are military in nature. One depicts the surrender of the British in 1777 after the Battle of Saratoga. A second depicts the surrender of the British to Washington in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown. And the last one is of George Washington in December of 1783 resigning his commission. Here was the undisputed general, leader, best known, most popular person in the country of a successful liberating army, and he voluntarily turned control over it to the Congress. Because he didn't want America to have a monarch or a dictator. Last of all, it'd be him. And I was struck by that as I saw these marauders, these rioters, these crooks, go through our Capitol building, in many cases in the rotunda in front of these paintings. And I was also struck by something else I used to point out on the trip. You go to a couple of 100 feet further north, you get to the Ohio clock. It stands out in front of the Senate chamber. We call it the Ohio clock because it has 17 stars on it, and Ohio was the 17th state admitted to the Union. In 1983, a communist terrorist group bombed the United States Capitol. That's something that wasn't terribly widely reported or remembered. You can look it up. But a communist group actually bombed the U.S. Capitol in 1983. And there you see, to me, the 2 poles of legitimacy. Okay, communists believe that political power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Chairman Mao said that. Bolshevik actually means, anybody know what that means in Russian? It means minority. But they had a will to power. They would engage in violence, and they would do things to their enemies and seize power that other people wouldn't do. Or you have the American idea, as represented by General Washington, turning over control of the army back to civilian authority, back to the elected representatives. I know where I stand, and I know where this group stands. We stand with George Washington and the Constitution of the United States. And if we stand there as a country and a party, we'll be fine.
In our United States legislature in Washington, do you agree that the most powerful person right now is Representative Joe Manchin from West Virginia?
Yeah, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Oh yeah. Do I agree Joe Manchin's got the most clout right now? Sure. Because Democrats have, it's worth noting, Nancy Pelosi's election day did not go according to plan. She thought Democrats would gain at least a dozen, maybe a couple dozen U.S. House seats. So she would have a very large majority with a margin for error. She could pass about anything. And then if Democrats took control of the Senate, whatever Chuck Schumer could get through, she could then pass and Biden would sign it. The Democratic House majority, depending on New York 22 and some of these other places, might be only 9 seats. You have 222 Democrats sworn in to the next Congress, a couple of which have been appointed now in the administration. They got sworn in. They voted for Pelosi as Speaker. But January 20 comes, they're going to take their federal appointments, they're going to resign their seats, and it takes a couple of months to do the process of special elections. No appointments to the U.S. House. So for much of this year, Nancy Pelosi is going to be operating with the barest of constitutional majorities, maybe 218 members, 219. But again, is Joe Manchin the best positioned person in the Capitol? Probably so. Because if he says no, he joins with the Republicans and makes a Senate majority. So what will he go for and will he not go for? You know, some of the scarier parts of the Democratic agenda, okay? Abolishing the legislative filibuster, okay? Will that happen? I don't think it will. There's enough Democratic institutionalists who remember when they were in the minority and who know they may be in the minority again one day, okay? I think with Joe Manchin, probably we can keep that from happening. But yeah, he's the most powerful person in the Capitol right now, no doubt.
Yeah, to me, we Republicans lose the information battle, but just can't get a message across, especially unified. That socialism, which is what we always talk about with the Democrats, to everybody that just means a free lunch. Why don't we change the terminology to Marxism, which is what socialism leads to, if it isn't it directly?
Whatever messaging you want to try, I encourage you to try. I do remember, I have actually heard tell they tried that in some various focus groups. And folks believed the term Marxism or communism was extreme, whereas socialism was fair because even people like Bernie Sanders will adopt the term socialism for themselves. So they actually tested that and voters considered the socialist charge more credible, more believable. So I think there's a tactical answer there. What's the difference between one and the other? I mean, you know, either you have property rights or you don't, okay? We're talking about founding principles of the American Republic. No citizen shall be deprived of their property without due process.
Well,
Judge.
Since Georgia turned into our worst case scenario, tell us about the hope we have for 2022. We should take the House, take the Senate again.
I mentioned redistricting. If you also understand that 2022, we redistrict because we first reapportion. Those are two separate processes. The process of reapportionment occurs after a census where you move congressional districts and therefore electoral votes by state because of population. California became a U.S. state in 1849, the 49ers, okay? In every subsequent census, 1850, 1860, 1870, every subsequent census, California gained congressional seats until 2010 when it didn't gain any. It was the first time in the history of California statehood it grew more slowly as a state than the rest of the country did. In 2020, they'll probably lose a congressional seat. 2, you're saying? Yeah. Ideas and policies have consequences, okay? The net domestic outmigration from California is extraordinary, okay? You ought to price what it is to get a U-Haul from California to Texas, okay? It's really cheap to get one back. Yeah, they need people to drive U-Hauls from Texas back to California, okay? So that process, reapportionment, which will move congressional districts from blue states to red states because people are moving from blue states to red states, and then further redistricting, okay, alone on paper ought to net enough Republican seats for a majority. Now, as we say for the NFL playoff games this weekend, that's why they play the game. We don't play these on paper. Candidates matter, campaigns matter, okay? But if we do not regain the congressional majority in each chamber in 2022, we've done something wrong. It's there. We ought to have, realistically, the expectation of victory. Now go out and do the work to earn it.
In 2016, Trump, during the primary, 35%, we got most we got in any primary. And a lot of that, I think, there were Trump Republicans, new Republicans at the time. Are they going to be around the next time?
Yeah.
And we're going to replace that with another hurdle to get over.
By definition, anybody who is a successful nominee of a party that had lost the previous election has brought somebody new, okay? Okay, we had Reagan Democrats, we had the Obama surge, and you had Trump voters. Many cases were people that hadn't been voting at all before, okay? Trump, in this last election got the second most popular votes anyone ever gotten for president. The only person who ever got more votes than Trump in 2016, or 2020, was Joe Biden in 2020, okay? What do those new participants in the electoral process choose to do? I sure hope they stay. Their country sure needs them, okay? But in a way, it's up to us to field the candidates and have the messaging worthy of their support. But there's no reason they should quit the field now, because the ideas they care about are just as important now as they were 2 months ago. But that's a great question. You saw certainly with the Obama coalition, when he was on the ballot in 2008 and 2012, that coalition rallied to him. When he wasn't on the ballot personally, 2010, 2014, they didn't show up.
Having your experience in kind of knowing the situation in Georgia, was that something where Trump's visit is actually a negative for those two candidates?
Mark Mellman is a Democratic pollster who has a great saying, a third of what we do in campaigns doesn't matter, but we don't know which third. Okay? Coach, you decided to go for it on 4th down late in the second quarter. Is that why you lost the game? Well, we ran 40 offensive snaps and played 38 defensive snaps after that. So was that what cost us the game? I don't think so. Did it matter? Yes, it did. Did Trump's visit matter? Probably. Was it a net positive or a net negative? You could argue it both ways. Okay. I'll say this, based on the data I've seen, the reason we lost the Senate runoffs in Georgia is because our voters did not return to vote, to your question, at the same level they had voted in November, okay? You can argue why that's true, okay? But to the extent the focus was, let's try and get the people who showed up in November to show up again in January, that was the correct strategy. Was having a rally with the president the correct tactic to fulfill that strategy? I don't have enough data to say.
Sir, thank you for your time today. I was on the ground in Georgia talking to my board young Republicans, so I agree with the assessment. There was a lot of vote fatigue, there was some issues with the candidates, and the turnout was just down. All over the country. My question to you goes on two things. People are disaffected right now. They're interested in the tea. They're irate. Understand it themselves. We're in a representative republic, and they feel like their leaders in Washington do not represent their interests or their viewpoints. There's a lot of talking stuff about starting a third party. Two questions I have. Number one, what is your idea on that? I'm more of the mindset that you don't read into the wheel, but you get into the car and grab the driver's wheel. Number two, and that's third party talk. Number two, the messaging piece. If you're talking about federalism at the lowest of the state level, the engagement, what should the messaging be in every echelon to make sure that we win on the big 2022 and 2024?
Great questions. One, I think, more tactical, and the second, more of a bigger idea, okay? Let's talk about the tactical idea of third parties, okay? Third parties in the United States tend to follow one of three trajectories. Either one, and this is very rare, they supplant one of the two major parties. The Republican Party started as a third party, okay? The Whigs did not represent the passionate interest of people like those in Kansas who wanted to abolish slavery and preserve the Union, okay? And so the Republican Party was founded as a third party, which simply overtook the Whigs, and the Whigs ceased to be, okay? So there is precedent. That is a rare precedent. The second thing that more normally happens with third parties is they don't go very far, or they advance a particular issue very powerfully. A Peace Now party, the America First party, the Progressive Party, the Populist Party for workers' rights. And then that platform gets adopted by one of the two major parties, the way the Populist and Progressive Party got folded into the Democratic Party, okay? Or the way, really in pre-World War II, you saw the America First Party become part of the Republican Party, okay? Most third-party movements go one way or the other in that respect. The way the Reform Party movement really tended to become part of the Republican Party. So tactically, the third-party route very rarely works. It's usually a waste of energy. In fact, it's a diffusion of energy that strengthens your opponents because you divide your votes. The second thing I would say is, message issue. We've seen the Republican message, the conservative message, is most powerful when it is paired with populism. Here is what I think has been a disconnect between our rhetoric and the values of our voters and our actions, okay? If I were to associate President Trump with two slogans, it would be Make America Great Again and Drain the Swamp, by which he was referring to the morass that is the federal government, okay? If you're going to drain the swamp, the water in that swamp is taxpayer money, okay? We have spent and borrowed more money over the last 4 years than we've ever spent and borrowed before. If you're going to drain the swamp, you got to deal with that. I think if we're going to be the party that correctly points out or that taps into the fact the American people already believe that Washington doesn't represent them, okay, we need to be the party that takes money and power out of Washington and returns it to families, businesses, and local governments. Okay, my opinion.
Mr. David